Hello dear viewers, welcome to our today's session, and in today's lecture we're going to talk about the summary of the book Why Nations Fail, and along with this I've brought for you major lessons which I've extracted from this book, the main points, and of course some critical analysis will also be done. And this video is highly recommended for all of those who are taking their competitive examinations, as well as for the students of political science and international relations. It really is beneficial for them. So without further ado, let's get right into it. Before jumping into the lessons or the overview of the book, let's just have a quick review of the authors. First, on the right side, we've got Daron Acemoglu. He is a Turkish-American economist. He's been working in the Massachusetts Institute of Technology. He has written many scholarly papers and books as well. Along with that, his fields of interest include political economy, economic growth, income inequality, and human capital development, along with labor economics. On the left side, we've got Professor James Robinson, I should say, and he's also a political scientist. Both Acemoglu and Professor Robinson went to the same institute, London School of Economics, and now Professor Robinson has been working as a professor of global conflict studies at the University of Chicago. His interests include political economy, comparative politics, and economic and political development. So this is very necessary to have a quick review or just to know something about the authors, because then we'll be knowing what kind of perspective the authors are going to come up with. So we have authors Daron Acemoglu, economist, and Professor Robinson. He's also a political economist. So we'll be having just a prediction, we'll be having politics plus economics in this book, and that will answer some of the basic questions of today's world, of today's inequality, like why some nations are failed, why some nations are stuck in poverty, and why some nations are prosperous. So this was a quick and brief introduction of authors. Now let's move towards the overview of the book. The overview of the book includes three things, and that the first one is reasons for the failure of nations. This book has come up with the answers of failure, of the reasons of why some nations are failed and why some nations are prosperous and successful, and it negates many orthodox and many useless hypotheses which were built in the past few centuries, which gave the answers of why nations fail, but that's just not right according to this book. We'll be having a review of that, of course, in the upcoming slides. So that was the first thing. It answers the questions why nations fail, this book, if you read it. Secondly, the whole book, the theme of it revolves around two things, and that is inclusive and extractive institutions. We'll be in the upcoming slides, we'll be having a look on these institutions, what kind of role they play, and which one is beneficial for the state to be prosperous and for a nation to be successful, as well as what is the link between them and what kind of loops and cycles both of them create. So let's move on to the next slide, which in that slide we'll be having 6 major lessons which I've extracted, which I've brought for you in today's video. First major lesson which we can get from this book is the nature of political and economic institutions determine the fate of nations. To put it simple, it's not geography, it's not culture, it's not ignorance of the leaders which determine the fate of nation. Rather, it's the role of political and economic institutions. They determine that what the fate of a nation will be. To give you an example, Nogales, Arizona. Let's just write here Arizona. A stands for Arizona, and Nogales, Sonora. S stands for Sonora. This one, Arizona, it's on the side of USA, and Nogales, Sonora is on the side of Mexico. Let me write USA and Mexico also here. Now, despite having same culture, same geography, same climate, same historical background, there are striking differences between both of the country. Let me just draw a line between them. Nogales, Sonora, to be honest, is poor. It's not rich. It's been facing a lot of problems like chronic diseases, and has no access to education, and there's no access to healthcare as well. There is no infrastructure, roads are not constructed, no other educational and political institutions. I mean, their life is just terrible. On the other side, if we take the example of Nogales, Arizona, which is on the side of USA, and this is Mexican USA border, let's say, this Arizona with same culture, with same geography, it's not like Nogales, Sonora. It is rich. It's not poor. It is rich, and it has all of the basic necessities of life, and has higher life expectancy rate, and has access to education. The people I'm talking about, they have access to the healthcare, and there is electricity, there are good infrastructure, and their incomes are high. Like their GDP, of course, will eventually that will be high as well. Now, the question arises here: if the geography is same, if the culture is same, so why are there so many differences? Why one nation and one state is failed, and why others prosperous? The answer lies in the first point, and that first point says the nature of political and economic institutions, they determine the fate of nations. It's not in the case of Nogales, Arizona, in the geography which play a role. Of course, geography and culture and the leader and their policies affect to a great extent the fate of the nation, but the real thing, the crux, the thing, the factor, the entity which really determine, which really make sure the progress of a nation are political and economic institutions. If that example is not enough, let's move towards the example of North and South Korea. This is a line between North and South Korea in international relations, or their border is known as 38th parallel. And on the one side of 38th parallel, there is South Korea, and on the other side of it, there is North Korea. Now, again, just like we've seen in Nogales, Arizona and Nogales, Sonora, there were striking differences between them. This is the same case with North and South Korea. South Korea after the World War II went into the hands of USA, and North Korea into the hands of Russia. In North Korea, dictatorial regimes were there who were making sure just their power and their regime, and they were not taking into account the basic necessities of life, and there was no democracy, no public opinion, no private business, nothing. And that's why nowadays North Korea suffers. It's not as prosperous as South Korea is. And if we take the example of South Korea after the World War II, it went into the hands of USA, United States of America, and there was capitalism, privatization, and companies were there. It brought foreign investment in South Korea, and public opinion, everything, every essence of democracy, every ideal of democracy was exercised by South Korea, and now it is one of the most prosperous country in the world. And so again, now if we say that geography hypothesis that holds water, or cultural hypothesis that holds water, or ignorance hypothesis that is also true, so then what about North and South Korea? What about Nogales, Arizona and Nogales, Sonora? So the reason behind the prosperity and the failure of a nation is in the political and economic institutions. If political and economic institutions are up to the mark, if they are strict, if they are obeying laws and orders, and if they are enacting right economic policies, and if political institutions are making right economic institutions, so then of course a country will not suffer despite their wrong location, or despite their not good geographical location. So that was the reason why some nations are prosperous and some are not, and that was because of political and economic institutions. Let's move towards another slide. The second point we've got, or the second major lesson we've got from this book as a summary, is the inclusive institution. I've talked about inclusive and extractive institutions a bit, but I didn't really tell you what these institutions really are. Inclusive institutions is a mixture of pluralism as well as centralization. Now these words are a bit complex, don't be worried. I'll make you understand about pluralism and centralization. They're very simple, but they are very important to know. Pluralism is it's a term, or it's a phenomena in which a government gives power to different groups, and there is distribution of power, and there is tolerance, and there is diversity, and there is peaceful coexistence of many groups. And there is peaceful existence of many groups, just like I've told. Tolerance, diversity, peaceful existence of many coexistence of many groups, and of course distribution of power, separation of power, distribution power. Power does not lie in the hands of only one individual or one group. A state where this phenomena exists, that is known as a pluralistic society, and that as a whole is known as pluralism. On this side, if we talk about centralization, centralization means a strong government, a strong head, a strong central entity which enact or which enforce all of the laws, and which make sure the security and peace in the society. Now, if we just take only one, pluralism, if a society, let's suppose for the sake of an argument, a society has tolerance, has diversity and peaceful coexistence, and there is distribution of powers, and power rests in the hands of many different groups and individuals. So when we have power, some masses or some people use power, but on the other side some abuse their powers. So when the power is abused, of course it will bring chaos and violence into society, and therefore to make sure there is no abuse of power, strong centralization is required, which gives us strong control on the exercise of power, and which makes sure the society has peace and security, and no one's right is violated or infringed. So inclusive institution, to put them together, an inclusive institution is pluralism plus centralization. If a society has pluralism and centralization, if their institutions are inherited or injected with pluralism and centralization, then of course that is inclusive institutions. And an inclusive institution, they are very necessary for the nation, and they, to be according to this book, they will put the country on the path of progress and prosperity. And many countries who had inclusive institutions, they have reaped the benefits of inclusive institutions, because their society is pluralistic, and it's also under centralization of a strong government. Example of Somalia is worth considering here, because in Somalia there was pluralism, but there was no centralization. The power was divided into different groups, and then of course there was diversity, but due to the abuse of power, the entity of tolerance that just ended in Somalia, and there was no strong centralization. Therefore, to put it in simple words, only pluralism will not suffice the need of a country to be a successful country in the world, or to be rich, or not to get stuck in poverty. It requires pluralism as well as centralization to be prosperous and successful in today's world of inequality. So this is all we had in the slide. Let's move on to the next one. The third major lesson which we got from this book is the pecking order of political and economic institutions. Now, if I ask a question, whether political institutions give rise to economic institutions, or economic institutions give rise to the political institutions, the answer for this one is political institutions give rise to the economic institutions, and therefore political institutions will come first and economic institutions will come on the second. Why? Because political institutions create economic institutions. Politics is a power. It is a power to govern, or it's a power of governance. So political institutions create economic institutions and their policies, and economic institutions in turn, they create incentives for the people to adopt or to work upon, and then of course these incentives directly or indirectly affect the economic institutions of the states, and hence economic institutions of the state are made if a country has the political will to create such economic institutions. If there is no political will, if the political institutions, or if the politicians, if they do not want to create the economic institutions which will bring prosperity to the country, so then economic institutions, a good economic institution in terms of today's world, a prosperous economic institution which can do good, that cannot exist if there is not the force of political political institution or politics behind that. For economic institution to create good incentives, good aims, and good objectives for the people and for the country, political institution must, should, and ought to support economic institutions and create such nature of economic institutions which eventually brings prosperity to the country. Hence, political institutions are known as the game changers, not economic institutions. Of course, economic institution has its own paramount importance, but the main one, as I've told you, political institution is on the first, and economic institution, they are on the second. So that's all we have on this slide. Let's move on to the next one. Now, this is the point which I've really liked while reading this book: critical junctures. Critical junctures, in short, they are major events. They're what? They are major events. And after these major events, some societies, their balance is changed, and some are not. Some bring positive change in their society, and some just place one tyrannical or brutal rule with another. So what does it mean actually? Critical junctures, as I've already told you, they are events. And to give you an example, or just to make a rough analogy, let's say there are two groups. And there is one event. That event has just happened, and the response or the outlook of one group, that will be different, and of another group, that will also be different. Till now, just get this: responses are different to the events. If we take the example of England was once hit by a bad disease which almost vanished, which almost disappeared its half of the population, and that was known as Black Death. Almost half of the population of England, there was a demise of that. There was a death of nearly half of the population. Now, when that occurred, of course, poor masses, they always suffered. Labor market, that was severely affected because all of the elites, they were not working and they were protected from the disease, and labor who were not protected and who did not have access uh, to healthcare or to institutions which provide basic health facilities. They were faced with the disease, and hence many died in that, and that of course affected severely the labor market because there were no laborers, but still the elites were forcing the few laborers to work for them. In response, as I told you, this was the event. This was the event, and the response of the labor were they rose for their rights. They didn't leave that to the elites. They rose for their rights, and of course, after that strong, let's say, they were over that strong force of laborers, of all the laborers, the elites were forced to grant them labor rights. This was a whole scenario, and that's how the society in England there was a balance. There was a balance in the society just because of one critical juncture. There are many critical junctures almost every nation has faced. Now it totally depends upon the nature of society and the response they elicit according to that event. So in England, response was that, and that's why there was a balance in the society, because when they were at critical juncture, they made a positive, they elicited a positive response, and hence the society was balanced. And if we talk about Eastern Europe countries, they as contrasted with the example of England, they did not do so, and of course then elites were there and they did not grant rights to such people, and then of course there was no balance in the society. And when there is no balance in society, the society is said to be a dictatorial regime or a dictatorial place where there is no democracy, where there's no public opinion, where there's no right of determination, where there's no freedom, nothing, or no freedom of press, nothing. It's only one elite or a few group of people, they are controlling each and everything, and the poor masses, they always suffer in such kind of regimes. So that's all I've brought you in this slide. Let's move on to the next major lesson. The major lesson which we can get from this book is the virtuous cycle. Virtuous cycle, as you can see, it's based on virtue, and these cycles are prosperous and they are good for a society, and they're very beneficial for the society or a state or a nation if that occurs. And what is that cycle? It's a cycle of inclusive institutions that create such incentives, or that create such positive feedback, which in turn create another positive feedback. Hence a loop is formed, a cycle is formed, and it becomes very difficult for other forces to intervene or to disrupt this cycle. If we talk about inclusive cycle, let me just draw it here. That's it. Let's just take the example of this inclusive cycle. There's one inclusive institution, of course, in that inclusive institution, I've already told you, is run by pluralism as well as rule of law as well as centralization. If that holds these two entities and these two forces, I'm talking of pluralism and rule of law, then of course it will make sure that another inclusive institution is also there. It means, in simple words, it will protect another inclusive institution, and this inclusive institution in turn will support this one in terms of pluralism, in terms of diversity, tolerance, and peaceful coexistence, as well as in terms of the enactment of laws or the enforcement of laws. So hence a loop is formed, a cycle is formed, and hence the cycle is very good for a nation or a state, because there would be no external powers, external forces, let me say negative forces of extractive institutions or narrow elites or corrupt corrupt leaders to interfere in this cycle. And if they, this is very hard at first to interfere in this cycle. If they, let's suppose, for the sake of an argument, if they interrupt this or disrupt this cycle, then of course there would be a force of inclusive institution that will throw away that external force, or that extractive force of that of institution. So hence, one is protected by another, and another is protected by the one. So in this manner, inclusive cycle is formed, and it results in more inclusiveness. It results in more inclusiveness. There will be if there is more inclusiveness, of course it will bring more prosperity to the nation and to the state. On the other slide, if we take the example of extractive institution, everything will get clear to you, or the main theme which I talked about in the overview of the book, that we've got two institutions, inclusive and extractive. This is how the inclusive institution makes its cycle, and in the upcoming slide we're going to see how extractive institutions work. So we've got vicious cycle, brutal cycle, tyrannical cycle, or barbarous cycle. A cycle, in other words, which is not good, or which is harmful for the society or for the nation to exist. And that's how extractive institutions work. Extractive institutions create negative feedback loops. How do they create? Let's again just take to example one extractive institution, another extractive institution. This extractive institution makes sure that it dominates, because it has a leader which is an elite, or which is a poor, not poor, which is a tyrannical political leader, and it makes sure that all of the power, there is no diversity in extractive institutions, there is no tolerance, there is no peaceful coexistence, and the power is in the hands of one elite. So on the other hand, if we have another elite, of course he will try to get all of the power, to usurp all of the power, to exercise all of those power which are not constitutionally in his let's say in his place, or in his hands, I should say. So one elite or one extractive institution affects another, and another, for the sake of power or to get power, affects another. And hence, what is created? Violence is created between them, and that's how they continuously create chaos in the country. And as a result of that chaos, of course, if in a country there's instability, there's political instability, there's economic stagnation, and if there is violence, there is chaos, then of course it will create negative feedback loops for a country, negative feedback cycles for a country, and that country, it will be very hard for them to survive or to be prosperous. Hence, those countries like Somalia and Congo and other countries, they suffer with poverty, because they're in the nature of their institution that is extractive, and if that is extractive, it will create extractive loops. It will create negative feedback loops. If we take the example, we'll have European colonialism or imperialism, where in England, let's say, not in England, in Europe, when they had many different colonies, so Sierra Leone was also one of them. Now, this point is very interesting to be construed or to be understood. When there was, let's say, imperialism, Europe had many different colonies. Sierra Leone was one of them, and the colonists, I'm talking of Europeans, they created such kind of institutions in those countries which would extract the benefit from the poor masses, and that benefit will go into the hands of colonists. Same was in Sierra Leone. Such institutions, I should say, it's not one, it were many in numbers, and they were created to bring all of the power into the hands of colonists. And the nature of of the institutions was made like this, and those institutions had three main things in common. And the one was paramount chiefs. They would control everything, and they would collect taxes. And second was marketing boards. Marketing boards, by this we mean that in the whole sector, the whole economy was made like this, where a poor people or a person who is working for the colonists will get only few of the resources, a few of the benefits, or the rest of the benefits will go into the hands of colonists or Europeans. That's why one of the reasons Europeans are rich nowadays, because they were colonists once, and they took all of the benefits, all of the resources, golds. They exploited the people, poor people of their colonies. And third, there was monopoly. There was no other institution to compete with such institutions, because there was no privatization, and there were only few industries, which were a few industries which were made due to the accent of colonists. And if colonists did want to create another institution, or if there was another institution in competition, then of course colonists would suffer. And because of that reason, colonists didn't let other institutions to grow. Hence there was only the monopoly of one institution, and that one institution made sure that everything, a little would go to the labor or poor or the colonists, and all or the rest would go into the hands of Europeans. The example of Sierra Leone is very interesting here. When colonists left, when there was a process of decolonization, and Sierra Leone was also, as I've told you, this was also a colony, and Sierra Leone was left with extractive institutions. Let me just write E here, and this is, let's say, inclusive institutions. When the leaders of Sierra Leone saw the benefits of extractive institution, or that small elite saw the benefits of extractive institution, instead of changing it into inclusive institutions, they maintained the extractiveness or those extractive institutions. So all of the benefits which once would go into the hands of colonists now would go into the hands of their leaders. That is why leaders, they maintained the extractiveness of institutions, or they maintained extractive institutions. Hence there was no positive revolution in Sierra Leone. There was no changing from extractive to inclusive institution. And when a country is stuck with extractive institution, of course the country will suffer, as we have talked about this example and about institutions in this lecture. So that was let's say all I have in this slide, and the next slide will be just having an overview of the whole lecture. So we brought we've extracted and we've got 6 major lessons from this book. The first one is nature of political and economic institutions. They determine the fate of the nation. It's not geography, it's not culture, it's not history, it's not the background, it's not the climate, it's not the ignorance of the leaders. It's about the political and economic institutions. They determine, or they make sure, the fate of nation. Inclusive institutions, I told you, it's a mixture of pluralism and centralization. Pluralism, they were the in pluralism, there were the entities of diversity, of peaceful coexistence and tolerance, and of course separation or division of power into many groups and individuals. And in centralization, there was a strong government which would enforce each and every law. So that was how inclusive institution is made. And pecking order, as I told you, political and economic institutions. Political will come in the first line, and economic will end up in second, because political institutions create economic institutions. Economic institutions do not create political institutions. Critical juncture, they were major events in the history. Every nation has major events in the history, and their response is different. I gave you the examples of England and Eastern Europe of critical junctures and their different responses and creating the balance in the society. And there was virtuous cycle, prosperous cycle, good cycle, positive cycle, which will give us more inclusiveness, and which will make sure the proper functioning of more inclusive institutions. On the other hand, there was vicious cycle, which was a harmful cycle and which would create violence between or among different extractive institutions, and hence there would be chaos and there would be instability, and the country will suffer if a country has extractive institutions, and that extractive institution will create vicious cycles. So that is it. That's all I've brought for you in this video, and thank you so much for watching it. Thank you so much for giving your precious time. I really appreciate it, and that's it for today. And thank you so much once again, and see you in the next video. Take good care of yourself. Bye.